Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors and editors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Dr. Robert Runté, talking about The Traitor's Son and Corridor to Nightmare, the last two novels by the great Dave Duncan, which he edited. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to other authors and editors about their latest books. I am myself an author and an editor. As an author, I have written more than 60 books of fiction and nonfiction for readers of all ages. My fiction is largely science fiction and fantasy. Some 20 novels or thereabouts, I've lost track, and a dozen of them for DAW Books, including my most recent novel, which is The Tangled Stars, came out in late 2022 in ebook and audiobook. It's an outer space adventure, far future outer space adventure featuring an AI-uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain. It's also a heist novel, and yes, it is somewhat humorous, as you could probably tell from the description. I hope you'll check that out. As an editor, I primarily work with my own publishing company, Shadowpaw Press, although in the past I have edited magazines and newspapers and other people's books that I'm not publishing and all sorts of stuff. My publishing company is Shadowpaw Press, and it's also the publishing company for the two books we'll be talking about today, Dave Duncan's The Traitor's Son and Corridor to Nightmare. But I publish many other things. Let me just give you a view of some of the most recent ones. Well, let's see. Let's do this one. I just a couple of weeks ago, as this airs, probably just the week before this one is airing, I was talking to Linda Monahan about her new poetry book, The Door at the End of Everything. I didn't have a copy when I did that interview, but I have them now. This one will just be out when this goes live. So I am doing poetry. I don't edit the poetry, but I do publish the poetry. I also recently published this literary novel, Let Us Be True. This is a reprint of a novel that came out in 2015 and was highly acclaimed. And the author is Winnipeg author Erna Buffy, and I also talked to her just a couple of weeks ago here on the podcast. Somebody else I've talked to twice now is Robert J. Sawyer. Robert J. Sawyer's The Downloaded came out in May, alongside The Traitor's Son by Dave Duncan, one of the books we'll be talking about today. And this started life as an Audible audiobook original with Brendan Fraser in the cast. So Robert J. Sawyer, of course, is a Hugo Nebula Award-winning author and Canada's best-known author of science fiction. That's from Shadowpaw Press. More recently, I have 3 books by Governor General's award-winning author, Arthur Slade. It's hard to say author and Arthur, one after the other. Arthur Slade. It's collectively called Canadian Chills, 3 middle-grade spooky books. There's Return of the Grudstone Ghosts. There is Ghost Hotel. Those 2 are both ghost stories, as you can probably tell. The first one set in Moose Jaw, the second one in Saskatoon, and the third book is called Invasion of the IQ Snatchers, and I would call it science fiction. It's set in Nanaimo, and you can see these great covers, all 3 by the same artist. Elaine M. Will is a Schuster Award-winning artist right here in Saskatchewan. So strong Saskatchewan connections on those books for sure. The other one I want to mention that's fairly recent is Shapers of Worlds Volume 4. This ties in very much with the podcast because it features authors who I interviewed on the podcast. I've kickstarted 5 of these. This is the 4th one. The 5th one's in the works and will be out in early 2025. Before that to backers, but to the general public in early 2025. And finally, I do want to hold up this one because although for some reason I don't seem to have a copy of The Traitor's Son in the house, it's over where I store my books. I do have several copies of the new Dave Duncan book, the newest one, Corridor to Nightmare, one of the 2 that we'll be talking about. And this also just came out as this podcast goes live. Dave Duncan, Corridor to Nightmare, and you'll hear a lot more about that in a minute as I talk to today's guest, who is Dr. Robert Runté, who edited both of those books. So let me tell you about Dr. Runté and put on my reading glasses so I can read it. Robert Runté, Ph.D., is Senior Academic Editor with essentialedits.ca and freelances at sfeditor.ca. He was for nearly a decade Senior Editor at Five Rivers Publishing, where he acquired and edited more than 30 books, primarily speculative fiction. A retired professor, he has won 3 Aurora Awards for his literary criticism, wrote the Canadian speculative fiction entry for the Encyclopedia of Literature in Canada, published the NCF Guide to Canadian SF, and has given more than 100 presentations and workshops at writers' conferences. He currently reviews for the Ottawa Review of Books. As a writer, he has published more than 100 short stories in a variety of magazines and anthologies, 6 of which have been reprinted in best of collections, and 1 of which was shortlisted for an Aurora Award. And you can find him at essentialedits.ca online. And you can find him right here as I talk to him now about Dave Duncan's last 2 novels, The Traitor's Son and Corridor to Nightmare. So, Robert, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's not very hard to find a connection here. I always start these things by trying to find connections, but we've known each other for a long time. We've worked together. You're on my editorial advisory board for Shadowpaw Press, and of course now you've the 2 Dave Duncan books we're going to be talking about, you edited. So, but I've never interviewed you, so this is new territory, I guess.
Yeah.
So tell me, I guess the place to start is telling people about Dave Duncan. Who was Dave Duncan?
Dave Duncan was born in Scotland, but he moved to Calgary as a geologist. He got involved in the oil industry, and he had a very successful career for 30 years there. And then in the 1980s, there's a little contraction in the oil industry in Alberta. Simultaneously, his first book sold, and he switched from being a geologist to a full-time writer and had a fabulous career. Over 65 books, not counting the 2 from Shadowpaw. So I think we're up to 67 or 68 books now. Very prolific writer, but also a very influential one, especially among Canadian writers. I'd say there are 5 or 6 things that separated him out from other fantasy and science fiction writers. One was that he created protagonists in the day and age when American science fiction was all about alpha males, or alpha males dressed up as women, but really they were still sort of alpha male personalities. Whereas his heroes were just sort of average people that got caught up in stuff and often didn't really know what was happening and weren't necessarily in control. And where American heroes always won by dint of being more tenacious, stronger, smarter than anybody else, his heroes kind of bumbled their way through. Now, he did have some books about con men that I really loved, fantasy con men. So those, the hero definitely was smarter than everybody around him. But in a lot of his books, it was just like the stable boy who ended up being the hero. So that distinguished him quite a bit. And I think that allowed other Canadian writers to go to the same route, the sort of the modest Canadian who, you know, we never see ourselves as the captain of the starship. We see ourselves as the guys who designed the Canadarm. You know, there's a difference there. Another thing that distinguished him from other fantasy writers is that his were always thoroughly researched. So, you know, while it might be a secondary world unrelated to Earth, if it was sort of designed about the Italian Renaissance, then he would research the hell out of the Italian Renaissance. If it was medieval Scotland, then that's what you got. Unlike many other fantasy writers, especially in the early days, who thought fantasy meant anything goes, right? And just the wizard would come and wave his wand. He always researched the cultures, what sort of a Bronze Age or Iron Age sword culture would be like, and then projected that into his books. The third thing is his magic systems were completely original at a time when other people were rewriting endlessly Tolkien. He set out completely original and often magic systems that took shots at the standard Celtic kind of vision that other authors were redoing endlessly. For example, his Man of the World series, he has elves and gremlins and whatnot. But as you read his book, you realize that the image of gremlins is strictly racism from the part of rather mean and heartless humans who've described this, you know, perfectly understandable culture once you're in it as vicious and nasty. And the elves as, you know, these ethereal creatures, but really not so much once you get to know them in Duncan's books. And the underlying magic of his books are just completely brilliant. Like there's Nobody's ever come close. And over top of that, Duncan's books always had something to say over and above sort of the fantasy adventure, the science fiction adventure. His science fiction was always sort of thought experiments, what if? His fantasy was always, these original magic experiments, but also, usually there's some kind of point to his books, another layer, another 2 or 3 layers, then we would get in other fantasies. Even today, a lot of the fantasy that comes across my desk as an editor suffer from wandering around syndrome. So you get a band of characters, they get together, they wander through the geography, but and they defeat the evil wizard, but you go, okay, what was the point of that? What's to remember 2 hours after you finish that book? Whereas Duncan's books always had something to say beyond and above that. So thematically, they're always, I thought, more interesting than the competition. Similarly, he always pushed himself. Fifth thing that distinguishes him else from other writers in fantasy, he didn't keep rewriting the same book. Now, he did have some series, set in the same universe, but they would always have completely different points. The one exception to there was the Man of His Word series, which was set out as a 4-book series. So it was really just a really long novel. But when he turned the last book into his editor back then, the editor said, you realize you have a logical loophole here. That the villains, can do this because you didn't close off this avenue of magic. And Duncan kind of face palms and goes and writes another 4 books to close the loophole. So with that exception, so, one of his other series, the King's Blades, King's Swords, they're all set in the same universe, but they're all completely different. Like a couple of them are just fall down funny comedies, and at the other end we have a couple of the darkest books I've ever read. So he was always trying to do something new and different. I think the most he pushed himself was in the Great Game series, but that might have been a step too far. I think a lot of his fantasy fans had trouble. Sort of the World War I, the Yeats kind of illusions, I think, escaped a lot of modern readers. So that was maybe a little too far. But I loved it. I mean, anybody my generation who was familiar with that period, was familiar with the illusions, we just thought, oh, this is brilliant, right? But he was always trying to experiment and do something new, which I really appreciated. And always trying to push himself stylistically, push the literary end of what was speculative fiction. And finally, for me, he was a real role model because he started writing as a second career in his 50s. Any of us who are in the writing industry, we're always looking for the new young Turk, the guy who's just graduated the creative writing program in some university and is going to be the next great thing. And here Duncan proved, you can still do that when you're older. And being older, I really found that encouraging. So he's a real success story. I mean, 67, 69. We're going to see if we can push it to 70 at some point, books. After 55, that's not bad. And like I said, a role model for all of us. So quite an influential writer. I think a lot of other Canadian SF writers, certainly of his generation, took inspiration from his work. And I think he had a real impact.
I think he was probably well, not quite. I guess when I was in university, I had a book signed by Gordon R. Dixon. But other than that, he was probably the first notably published professional science fiction fantasy writer that I encountered, because he came to the Saskatchewan Science Center as a guest of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild and did a reading in one of our spaces, which at the time had like a planets and solar system imagery behind him. And we went out to dinner and I met him and talked to him, and I was inspired then. I was in my 30s, but I hadn't published anything except a couple of short stories. And the same thing. It's like, oh, you're just now starting, and you're, because at that point he was probably just a couple of books in, maybe 3 or 4 books into his career. And here, and you're already over 50, and you're going. And then I was almost 40 before I had any novel published, and over 40 before I had one published by a significant publisher. So he was kind of a model for me as well.
Yeah.
Now we need to talk about you. Who are you anyway? And how did you connect with Dave Duncan?
Well, like you, I saw Dave Duncan at the first time at a reading. What had happened is in the 70s, I was trying to read all of the great science fiction, which meant all of the Hugo and Nebula award winners. And I just started that when I discovered that some of these people were Canadian. And I thought, oh, there's a Canadian science fiction. So I devoted myself to reading all the Canadian science fiction there was, which was a possible thing to do in the 1970s. It's no longer remotely possible. I can't even keep up with the major trends now. So I became a bit of a reviewer. I put out a fanzine. I review books. And somebody said, oh, there's this guy doing a reading at the public library. So I went down and heard him, and it was Dave Duncan. So I immediately went out and got his other book that was available and reviewed those, gave him good reviews, and then started to know him at conventions. As I was reviewing over the years, there was one book in particular that was brilliant right up until the end of the book, not Dave's, somebody else's. And the ending was just appalling. It was as if, the ending turned out to be giant ants. And I thought, well, how did this get published, right? So it was a very mixed reviewer. I said, well, look, it's brilliant, but right up to the last 20 pages, and then it falls off a cliff. And it kept bugging me. So I actually wrote the author and said, what happened? How did the editor let this go to press with this appalling ending? And he kind of winced and said, well, what happened was the editor got sick halfway through editing my book. And the publisher said, well, we have the slot already set up with the printer. He loved the first half of your book, so we're just going with it as it is, right? And so I said to myself, I need to get to the books before I have to review them, right? Because I could have saved that book and made it, much more successful than it was. It was reasonably successful as a Canlit book, but as SF, it could have been a big time book. So I became interested in editing, and then coincidentally, I reviewed Lorena Stevens' book, and I was one of the people, I guess, that gave it a rave review. So we started a correspondence, and she said, oh, well, you're interested in editing. Why don't you come edit for me? So I started by editing one of her books, and then I became an editor with her little publishing company, and then it became a bigger publishing company. And she hired another editor, so that made me senior editor with the publisher. And I did that for about a decade. And became reasonably well known in the field as an editor, as I was still reviewing as well. And I also tried to do my own writing, but I was for many years a professor, and in that publisher parish environment, I couldn't find time to write fiction. But since then, I've retired. I've had over 100 short fiction publications, and I'm still working on my novel. The outline was from 1971, but I didn't actually put anything on paper until 2008. And then during Rimo Nimo, I would write, another section of the book, another 50,000. And then I had to cut it back a bit and send it out to beta readers. I got completely different responses from 12 beta readers. 6 said, oh, you have to take out the romance. It's a distraction. Stick with the science fiction. That's good. And the other 6 said, oh, the romance is really good. Maybe tone down the science fiction and just go for it. So it took me a while to sort that out. And I finally found an editor for me who was perfect. It was a pleasure to work with her. And then COVID hit. She got long COVID and she was knocked out for 2 years. So that brought us up to now. And now she has her own project, AI versus author, where she's writing a novel a week.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just waiting for her to finish that. So next April, hopefully she'll find room to edit my book, and then I'll bring my brilliant novel out. Of course, as an editor, you think, oh, I don't need an edited because I'm an editor. I already know what to do. No, it's complete nonsense. Everybody has to be. You can't see the mistakes in your own stuff.
It's difficult, that's for sure. Until you read it out loud. So
yeah. So I'm currently reviewing for Ottawa Review of Books, and I'm on the advisory committee with their board for your public press. I think I'm not clear if I'm on the board or just hovering for around Donovan Street Press too. So same thing. So I keep my hand in, and I do edit. I still, even though I'm semi-retired, I still do a lot of editing. I have Fred Gambino's book on my desk at the moment, a sequel. His book came out in May from UK, is doing really well. So I'm doing the sequel now. So I'm busy.
And so how did you end up with Dave Duncan?
Oh, right. I got off topic there. Sorry. Dave Duncan, in the last few years, he retired twice from writing. He had minor strokes, and he thought, well, that's it. I can't do this anymore. And then as he got better, he said, oh, maybe I can do that. So what he did is went into his files and said, I've got to finish all of the books that I have here because I don't know how long before, if I have another stroke or I'm, in my 80s. And so he started working with me as his editor to polish and finish up these manuscripts. And the first of those was The Traitor's Son. Was Corridor to Nightmare was the first one. And so we just finished that, and he'd sent me Traitor's Son, and I was editing that the weekend he passed away. And then I discovered that he'd asked my advice earlier what to do about his literary estate, about the unfinished manuscripts. And I'd sent him an article I'd written for a textbook. And unbeknownst to me, he had arranged with his wife that if he should pass, those unfinished manuscripts should all come to me to finish and get published. So I was pretty honored by that. But I was editing Traitor's Son as he passed away. In fact, it was sort of hours after he sent me the email that he fell downstairs and started the end. So Corridor to Nightmare was already done, more or less, right? And Traitor's Son was fairly easy for me to finish because basically I just made all of the edits I was recommending to him. And it was, as I said to people, I couldn't believe he'd passed away because I had been talking to him the whole weekend, because I'd come along to a paragraph and say, oh, maybe we should do this. And I could hear his voice saying, no, this is why I want. Oh, yeah, because I knew him so well. I'd edited so many of his books by that point and been a beta reader years before, that I knew what he would say before, so I wouldn't even bother saying it. So I was pretty sure the edits I'd made were ones that he would approve of. So, might have been one or two things he would have changed. But so both of those were fairly easy to do. I now still have 11 or 12 fragments that we may or may not have time before I get too old to work on and finish. So these were pure Duncan. The ones coming will be Duncan with Robert Runté, or Duncan with, if I can find somebody else who wants to finish them.
We should probably give some sort of brief synopsis of the two books that have come out now: The Traitor's Son, and Corridor to Nightmare. So, without going into huge amount of detail, huge amounts of detail.
As a reviewer, I hate spoilers. We won't be doing spoilers. Traitor's Son is a really interesting book. It's the most political book he's ever written. I think that might be one of the reasons he'd left it a little longer, because he wasn't always convinced he wanted to do that kind of layer, right? But it's really a political parable of our times. The basic story is that a colony ship has landed on the wrong planet and chosen the wrong site on that planet, and that everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. But the leadership doesn't acknowledge any of those problems, that they're just pretending everything's fine because the system's working for them even though everything else is going to hell. They're okay, and they're hoping that everything will stay okay while they're still alive, and then good luck to everybody else. Our hero is the son of someone they have murdered as a traitor to this elite, and they assume that he will be a traitor also, as his following his dad's footsteps as a dissident. So the themes of the book, it doesn't take a genius to realize really he's talking about climate change and how the oil industry and so on pays no attention to the fact that the world's on fire. I saw a meme the other day that showed all the fires in North America, and it's the whole bloody continent. There is hardly anywhere that doesn't, a couple of deserts. So it's hard not to read the book and say, oh yeah, we should do something about our selfish leadership too. But you can ignore all that and just have the adventure, which is the core of the novel. And the other theme, I think, is that people live up to our expectations of them. So because everybody's convinced that he's going to be a traitor and or the leader of the revolution, he ends up the leader of the revolution. So a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's kind of entertaining. But again, most people will just read the book and enjoy it for the fact that this is rollicking adventure.
Did he tell you what the theme are? Is that your interpretation?
That's my interpretation. No, I never thought to ask him because, I was just, as the editor, it seemed obvious to me as, that's certainly what I was working to bring out as I edited the book. And I try to amplify his voice, not impose my own vision, right. As any good editor would. So,
Corridor to Nightmare.
Corridor to Nightmare. And there's a story there. Like, I didn't ask him about what it was trying to do with Traitor's Son, because I hadn't finished editing, right? If I'd finished editing, then we'd have that conversation. And with Corridor to Nightmare, there's a sequel, or partly. But for the first time ever, he was blocked on it. This is the most prolific writer ever. He's never blocked. But it wasn't gelling for him. So he said, look, I've never done this before. I'm going to ask you as the editor to look at it and tell me what's wrong. Because normally I don't say anything out that isn't already in my mind perfect. Then people find flaws, right? Mm-hmm. So I looked at the sequel. I said, okay, here's why it's not working. It goes off the rail in like chapter 3. So we got to change all of this. And he thought about it. He says, yes, that'll all work. I see you're right. That's why it wasn't working. It will mean I have to change the ending. And I stupidly didn't ask him what the new ending was. So I'm still sitting on that one. That'll be the next one if I do try and write the end of the books. But it's only about, he had it 2/3 written, but a third of it had to be thrown out. So I think it's only a third there. So I'm not sure I'm a good enough writer. Sort of like to see my book come out so I could have a little confidence that I'm good enough. But I do still have his beta readers. So they won't let me put out anything that isn't up to standard for Dave, right? Well, they both cleared these 2 books too, right?
We should back up and explain what the story is in Corridor to Nightmare.
Sorry. Corridor to Nightmare. A school teacher, it starts with a school teacher at age 65 retiring. And then a mysterious stranger shows up, rescues her from a monster, and drags her through this portal to another world, where she eventually, essentially lives a whole new life in a new role. Again, I don't want to give spoilers away, but
and there's a lot that you can spoil in there just by describing the plot.
So it's about a clash of cultures. She comes from this really idyllic rural setting to this horrendously violent culture where there's unending cycles of violence and revenge. And she sort of she's being played as a pawn in these political games, and to survive, she has to stick to her values and kind of plow through all of that and to whatever ending is coming. I don't want to do spoilers.
Although there is a sequel, I think that the book stands on its own.
Oh, absolutely. I didn't know there was a sequel until I got the the book from him, right? It seemed to me a complete ending. So it does stand on its own. If the sequel never happens, it doesn't matter. Well, I mean, matters. Dave would like it to come out, but it's not necessary to enjoy this book. I lost my train of thought. That's why I have to write things down.
Well, both of them are out as this goes live. Both of them have come out, and
right.
And if my timing is what I think it is, this is airing the day after we did a launch for the book in Calgary, and of course, Dave was very well known in Calgary writing circles. You're actually in Lethbridge,
right?
But both within the Alberta community. How was Dave seen within the larger writing community, just in his own home province and city?
Oh, he's huge. Again, an inspiration to all the other writers that I knew. I don't think anyone, it was impossible to dislike Dave. I don't think anybody disliked him. He was huge in Calgary because he lived in Calgary. He's been there in the oil industry. It was only when he sort of retired that he moved to Victoria. So he was a central figure. Like I said, as soon as I met him, it became a huge character in my life. I think that's true for a lot of people. But, similarly, when he moved to Victoria, I know Carl Johansson, who's the editor of Neo-Opsis magazine, became close friends with him. Anywhere he went, writers would sort of flock to him because he had that experience. He was super successful. We all like to know how to do that. So, I think he was an important figure in the community. He would turn up at all the writers' conventions, do readings, be on panels.
Yeah, and I met him many times and had drinks with him and stuff, and I always really enjoyed Dave's company. So, and I'm so pleased that this publishing company, which has somehow sprung up around me, his are among the books I'm publishing, and yeah,
I think he'd be super pleased to know it was you that was doing it, right?
I would hope so.
It was a strange history because I had an agent do Dave's books, and he had a couple of deals lined up that would, be bigger presses or whatever. But, the bigger presses don't have that personal touch. They don't have that personal connection. So they don't have, I don't want to say it's not the commitment, but, it's marketing departments, not editorial departments that drive behavior, right? And as soon as they found out that his new books would be competing with a 65 book backlist, they had no interest, right? Because it wasn't about bringing out brilliant books. It's about sales. So finding a publisher who actually cares about the writing community, and I know, Dave is not the only writer that you're bringing out. You're doing a lot of Saskatchewan writers, right? And the literary community, and books that maybe are more, I don't want to say niche, but the literary end of things that mass publishers aren't particular. They want to sell 1 million,
I'd like to sell 1 million.
You'd like to sell 1 million, but I think we get way more personal attention, right? Like you edited both these books, on top of whatever I did. I think that kind of personal touch is really important. And the fact that he knew and trusted you, I think would be a huge factor for Dave. Certainly that was my response. That once I realized you had a press, I thought, oh, this is a stand-up guy. I'm taking them here. And it's been a great working relationship. So, like I say, I think I channel Dave fairly well. I think he's pleased with how it came out. Even, we should tell people the cover artist.
I was about to mention that, yeah.
Yeah, he's done a lot of covers for Dave books, and he grew up wanting to become a cover artist, reading Dave's books. And when he found out that he could do Dave Duncan covers for Five Rivers, it just blew him away. So again, I said, oh, here's this cover artist, and you used him just because it would be the nice thing to do, right? I'm blessed, they're great covers, but
Particularly the Traitor Son. I really like the Traitor Son cover.
Yeah, same here. It totally captures the mood of all of the romance, the science fiction, the fantasy. You know, like it's all.
And
there.
The fact that all the animals are basically spiders. So.
Oh, pardon me. Yeah, I got. As I was speaking, I just had the mental picture of the other one. Yeah, the spider cover. Yeah, that's creepy as hell.
And Corridor to Nightmare, as you say, and you can certainly tell looking at the two of them that
what you're getting.
Yeah, the fantasy cover is a fantasy cover, and the science fiction cover, it could be fantasy, but I read it as science fiction when I see it. So,
yeah, I meant to say earlier when we were talking about Corridor to Nightmare, it's an interesting crossover book for Duncan. Because it reads like a fantasy novel, but underneath there's clearly the science fiction structure, the scaffolding, that it becomes clear as you read it that all of these magical artifacts are actually left over from a collapsed technological society, you know. And it's interesting. And then the romance theme is stronger in this one than almost any of his other books. So
But it's an interesting take on romance. So
yeah, very different.
Very different.
Again, he never does things the way other people have done them or that you might expect, right? It's always sort of out of left field, and you go, wow.
Well, as we wrap up here, you've talked about what you're working on with Dave's. What you still have of Dave's. What are you working on yourself? You've mentioned the novel. Anything else you wanted to mention? And how people can find you online?
Well, my website is essentialedits.ca, not to be confused with essentialedits.com. That's an editor in San Francisco that does movies. But essentialedits.ca is my webpage, so most of what I'm doing shows up there, including my CV that lists all of my short stories and new stuff coming out all the time. My most recent thing, I think, was episode of Lost Poets Society Club. Yeah, Lost Poets Club. They did an audio production of my Summoning Demons, which was good fun. Cool.
And I should mention that people can, of course, find Shadowpaw Press at shadowpawpress.com. You'll find both books are available there and available everywhere. You can order them through any bookstore, online or off, and I hope you do. So, so thanks, Robert, for being a guest on the Worldshapers. I hope you enjoyed the chat, and I look forward to as we're talking, we will see each other in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
As this airs, we probably saw each other this morning or something.
Yeah, I think we're still friends. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
But thank you for taking Dave's books. I could not have had a more trusted publisher, so I'm really pleased. I'm sure Dave is pleased.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. Bye for now.
Bye.
And thanks to Robert for that great conversation and for the kind words. I've been so happy to have 2 Dave Duncan books in the Shadowpaw Press stable, and have very much enjoyed working with Robert on my editorial advisory board as well. So yeah, do check out The Traitor Son and Corridor to Nightmare by the late, great Dave Duncan. All right, a few housekeeping notes. First of all, you can find the Worldshapers not only here on YouTube, which is probably where you're watching it, on my YouTube channel, but you can also find it anywhere that fine podcasts are purveyed in its own audio-only version, what I'm trying to say. You can find it online at its website, theworldshapers.com. You can find it on Facebook at The Worldshapers. You can find it on X at The Worldshapers. You can find me, Edward Willett, at edwardwillett.com. You can find me on X at ewillett. You can find me on Blue Sky at something or other. You can find me on Threads at something or other. Edward Willett Author, I guess, because that's my Instagram account. Facebook, I'm edward.willett. And you can, as I said, find me here on my YouTube channel, which is also Edward Willett, youtube.com/Edward Willett. And among other things on my YouTube channel, if you want to look a little further afield from the podcast, you'll find quite a bit of musical theater, and you will also find my walking in Regina videos. Several times a week, I live stream my walks around the city of Regina, and you can walk along with me as I blab on about this and that and point out the sights as I go by them. Finally, Shadowpaw Press, which published Corridor to Nightmare and The Traitor's Son, is at shadowpawpress.com. It's on X at Shadowpaw Press. It's on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press, and it's on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press. That's it for this episode of The Worldshapers. I'm going to continue talking to some of the authors that I'm publishing over the next few episodes. And then I've been going back and forth, but I think I'll probably be coming back with lots more great authors after that. So please check back every week for the latest episode of The Worldshapers. And thank you for watching this one. That's it for this time. Bye for now.